Kia ora, Aotearoa, and hello world. You are listening to the Yeah Nah podcast, the official podcast of the New Zealand Skeptics. I'm Bronwyn Rideout, and with me are my co-hosts, Mark Honeychurch.
Hey.
And Katrina Borthwick.
Hi.
I can see how this episode's going to turn out to be. In this episode, we are going to be bringing you a somewhat more balanced offering of science, skepticism, and religion. Mark and Katrina are going to let us know whether the evidence supports certain claims made about the harms that sugar and microplastics entail for our health. And I'm doing my deep dive into the Christian missions organization Youth with a Mission, also known as YWAM, and share some of its early connections with New Zealand, as well as some of the emerging criticisms that have plagued the organization over the past decade. But before that, I think we have some kind of exciting news for some of our regular Skeptics in the Pub attendees, don't we, Mark?
Yeah, and the broader kind of humanist atheist community as well, but certainly specifically there are people at our Wellington Skeptics in the Pub that will be happy to hear this news. And the news is I was watching Parliament Live this evening, and there was an amendment bill for the Sale of Alcohol Act, whatever the heck it's called. And the amendment was to change one of our weirder laws about alcohol, which is that when you buy alcohol on certain days of the year, it has to be accompanied by a substantial meal. And it's coming up now because we're recording just before Easter, and it's something that is, I think, Easter Friday and Sunday are 2 days that are plagued by this. So yeah, there was basically a vote in Parliament to change this. It was a members' bill, so a member put it in, I think, what they call the biscuit tin. So they have like a ballot box where members can put in their own private ideas on what bills might be good for the country, what changes to law would benefit us all. And this one came out, and it's just been through the third reading today, so this is kind of the final step involved, and I listened to the arguments for it. It was kind of interesting, there were some sensible ideas from the one side about why this change should be made, that you don't need to buy a substantial meal. Things like the fact that people can already buy alcohol. Like, a lot of people on the other side were arguing, well, this is just going to make alcohol more available. It's like, well, not really, because you can already get alcohol on these days. You just had to buy a meal. Apparently, the law never defined what substantial meal means. So one MP brought up that, well, is it that maybe a bowl of wedges is not okay, but a bowl of loaded wedges with bacon and cheese is okay and is a substantial meal? And like, how are restaurants and bars meant to figure this out when the government's given no official guidance? There's nothing there to say what a substantial meal is. And another one pointing out that actually you don't even need to eat the meal. Just buying the meal and leaving it on the table apparently legally is enough. You can just order the food and leave it there. The other side, a lot of the arguments it was a mixture of this is the slippery slope, this is going to make alcohol more available, and I can't see that that's much of an argument. I mean, any alcoholic probably has a decent amount of alcohol at home as an emergency, or is at least compos mentis enough to prepare themselves for these 4 fallow days of the year: Anzac Day, Christmas Day, and the 2 Easter days. And the other side of it was just religion. Like, religion came up a lot, basically. I have this religious belief. I would like to impose my religious belief on the entire country. This is why I'm voting against it. Or, please, would people remember our Christian heritage? Would people remember where we come from? And it's like, this isn't even in the Bible. Jesus never said, don't drink on these days. If anything, it was kind of the opposite. It's like, eat, drink as often as you can in remembrance of me, was what Jesus said. But here are these religious people saying, no, my religion says, and like, this isn't canon. This isn't any kind of official rule for any religion. It's just something that organically came about a while ago. This isn't part of their creed. This isn't something core to their beliefs at all. But I guess they're seeing the losing of it as an erosion of their control, as an erosion of their ability to have a voice in public policy and laws. That's how it should be, right? Like, we live in a secular country, Our laws are not supposed to be there to advance the agenda of any religion. They should be fair for everybody. So yeah, the vote went through. It was, I think, 65 to 55. So it was actually fairly close. Apparently the bill originally was larger. It was going to try and cover maybe selling alcohol in supermarkets and potentially off licenses. But the member who had put this forward was advised that it was never going to go through if it was that big. So if he just focused on the on licenses, as they call them, the places where they have this food rule, and if you just get rid of this food rule, it's going to be a lot more likely to go through. But yeah, I mean, he spoke on it for like 10 minutes and did a really good job. And then a bunch of people, it was about half and half, speaking for and against, and 5 minutes each. It was a little bit sad to see the quality of some of the arguments. One of the arguments, I'll just say this quickly, like the worst one was a guy who stood up and said that the reason why he was voting against it and why others should is because he had a friend, and this is an MP, this isn't just a member of the public in here, this is an MP, basically said he has a friend who runs a takeaway shop, and that friend is a Christian, and they had decided to open their takeaway 7 days a week. And it made them sick, and they ended up in hospital, and they didn't know what to do, so they prayed to God, and God said to them, you should only open 6 days a week. And he did that, and apparently he got better, and his profits didn't go down. Therefore, everybody needs to vote against this amendment. I was just scratching my head at that. Like, I mean, it's a nonsensical story, and it's got nothing to do with these alcohol laws. Unless you're going to take away from it, you need to trust what God personally tells you for everything.
Yes, a lot of people do sort of see the alcohol on the holy days and the shops shutting on the holy days kind of together. We've come back a bit from that, but I think, you know, they sort of see that, you know, every little brick you take away is leading towards, you know, a situation where everything will be open on, you know, Good Friday, Easter Sunday, that kind of situation. Yeah. I think it's coming.
But, you know, and the reason these are chosen is because they're Christian. Like, we have a small and dwindling part of the population. It's their religious beliefs that are driving this idea that none of us, the majority of us that don't believe in the twaddle that they believe, that we also need to be beholden to what they think God might want. And as I said, it's not in the Bible. Like, there's nowhere that they can prove that God even wants this. It's just some ministers have decided that this is what God might be impressed with. Maybe it'll, you know, give them more chance of getting into heaven if they seem like they're being this pious. But this isn't something that religion requires. It's just something that's been, well, all religion's made up, but this definitely has been absolutely made up.
I'm curious. Did anyone bring up like a scientific argument, like whether there's evidence for or against the concept of eating, reducing alcohol content, and how useful is that? Because you can have a pretty low blood alcohol content and actually be far more impaired than someone who may have a higher blood alcohol content.
There was nothing about that. There were, I think, a Green MP and one other MP talked about, you know, increasing availability of alcohol is bad for alcoholics, which is, it's almost a non sequitur. Yeah, of course it happens. But, you know, that the other side was trying to say, well, this isn't really increasing the availability of alcohol very much at all. The other thing was one national MP, she did say that studies have shown that this change will not make a difference, that this kind of availability to alcoholics doesn't change anything. No citing of what the studies were. I got the feeling maybe she was just making that up as she goes along. And the other thing I presume is that a lot of people who are alcoholics, who have this daily dependence on alcohol, they couldn't afford to drink in a bar every day. The days of being able to sit in a bar and get drunk every day are gone for anybody that's not earning multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. This is something where now you have to do it cheaper at home, I think. It's the rare lightweight alcoholic that probably could afford to be daily drinking in a bar, or maybe an RSA or something would make that a little bit more affordable, but it's still, alcohol's not cheap.
I think making the health argument misses the point, because you need to attack the reason for this rule being in place, which I think is a religious reason on these particular days. And so you have to go, well, hang on a minute, how many people have this religion? And, you know, that it's no longer, relevant to a lot of people, and they should be able to exercise their own rights to do what they want to do.
Yeah,
on
and even
those
for like
days.
Anzac Day being the only non-religious one, a few MPs talked about how they'd had feedback from their local RSA saying that, they were regularly disappointing their customers on Anzac Day because there would have been agreement amongst people who were in the army together that for their fallen colleagues that they have a drink on Anzac Day morning, and then they can't because it's not allowed, or it's only allowed with a substantial meal. And in other news, actually, because when I came down to sit at my laptop before we recorded, I still had Parliament streaming. They are currently discussing an amendment to the Copyright Act for parody and satire. So their exclusions to being able to claim copyright sounds like another sensible amendment. So it's really nice to see that in one day, two different things are being discussed that both, at least to my mind, seem to make sense and be logical changes. Obviously, a whole bunch of countries already have exceptions to copyright for satire and parody and other comedic things.
Well, those things are very relevant to the social media economy. People doing commentary videos. You do need some pretty strong laws to cover you. So I'm impressed that they are dealing with it.
I don't think it's third reading for that one. I think maybe that's just on the discussion around the second reading, but it'll be interesting to see if that one goes through as well.
Yeah, well, hopefully they make some rational decisions about that. I mean, it's a burgeoning economy.
Yeah, in the discussion, one of the MPs did mention memes, so it's nice to see they're keeping up with the times there in Parliament.
I wonder who may not like memes being made of them who are in Parliament.
Oh, so NZ First apparently said that they don't like this amendment because it allows people to make them look ridiculous. But the MP that was talking about this said they do a good enough job themselves of making themselves look ridiculous. They don't need anything else to do that for them.
I wonder if this is going to be something that the Free Speech Union is going to have some input into at some point.
I mean, I imagine they probably do have an opinion.
All right, thank you for that update, Mark. I guess we have something else that we need to keep an eye on. But moving on to our main pieces for tonight. Katrina, I'll hand it over to you. Do we need to be worried about microplastics? What does the science say?
Yeah, well, tiny things. Scary, scary. I guess I'm sort of interested in this because there's quite a lot of headlines that are quite scary about microplastics, and we all kind of have probably the experience of looking at bottles in the shop while buying them and it says BPA free, which I think is it's a plastic chemical. And so is there anything to this, or is this just overblown kind of scare that's going on? So microplastics are tiny little things. So if you imagine you're chopping your vegetables on a plastic chopping board, it might be the tiny little bits of that chopping board that come off. I think it's against the rules now, but they used to have scrubs that you could put on your face, like a soap with little tiny microbeads. That's another example. There's also little bits of plastic that come off bottles and bags and come off tyres when we drive on the road, and all of these turn into tiny little bits of plastic in your environment, and they can end up inside your body, so you can inhale them, you breathe them in, they might be in the dust in your house, you could end up eating them, and they can actually come through your skin. So there's a bit of talk about people using cosmetic products and including moisturizers and soaps and things like that. So are they everywhere? And I don't think there's any debate about that they are in our environment, but I guess the question is whether it's causing any health problems or issues, and is it really as bad as we think it is? There is a little bit of evidence of harm, I guess, using that term broadly, but this is research that has been done in sort of narrow circumstances. So, there was a study about the chopping board plastic on mice, and that did find that the types of plastic in that could cause gut inflammation. And then there was a second type of plastic that was also in the chopping boards that changed the microbial balance sort of in the bodies. But these are mice, right? These are not human beings. Then there was a study that was a couple of years ago, 2024, that found microplastics embedded in a human carotid artery plaque. So that's the plaque inside your arteries going but, not something that you'd expect to find. So it's actually getting inside the body. And another study reported finding microplastics and nanoplastics, which are even smaller than microplastics, in the human brain. And of course, that's quite a scary headline, that there are things in your brain, plastics in your brain, can't be a good thing. And then you've got other headlines like, microscopic plastics could raise the risk of stroke and heart attacks. So you've got plastic in your brain, spray plastic that could give you heart attacks. There's a bit of evidence there that if you're a mouse and you eat chopping board plastic, you could have some inflammation, you could have some changes in your metabolism, could change your fertility. They have also found microplastics in tonsil tissue, but they don't really know if they have any role in anything, but they're trying to see, well, does it have a role in thyroid disease? But I guess there's a lot of, we found some stuff here. It does some stuff in mice, but again, it seems to be missing a few steps in terms of this is evidence that there are definitely plastics in humans and that it's causing harm in humans. So I guess not everyone's panicking. The laboratory doses that have been used in the experiments so far, and there's not enough of them, to be quite frank, the doses are unrealistic. So if you gave a human the equivalent plastic diet of we're giving the mice, it's not realistic. It's not what someone's going to get exposed to. The animal and cell studies, so if you're studying a cell outside a body or an animal, those, the human body sometimes reacts differently to mice and single cells outside the body. So we don't know how a human body handles microplastics. And also, we found microplastic in poop. That means the human body is actually quite good at excreting microplastics and getting it out. And it may not need a hand, There's all sorts of weird things go into our bodies that shouldn't be there, including things that we maybe eat or alcohol. But our body is pretty good at dealing and sorting it out and making it come out again as we all poop. So that's the other one. The other thing too that is, I guess important, in terms of trying to find a voice of reason, is that the European Food Safety Authority, which is EFSA, and the FDA, which is more well known, the US Food and Drug Administration, they both say that so far levels of microplastics found in food are not shown to pose a human health risk. So it's talking about food, but it is about microplastics. So at this stage, they saying, go and take all plastic out of your house. And you can imagine too, trying to live without plastic. And plastic is in a whole lot of things that we probably don't realise. So if you have a paper coffee cup, for example, that is lined with plastic, that's why you can't put it in the paper recycling quite often. And there's all sorts of little things that have plastic bits and things in them. So you're trying to live without plastic is probably not super realistic, but you could certainly reduce them if it was something that was causing you stress. So there's definitely been a bit of back and forth on this. Even one of the heads of research in Germany just basically calling some of the studies a joke. So this was about the brain study. So this is showing the microplastics in the brain. And he said, actually, if you go in and you do a scan in the brain in the way that they have, then a lot of the stuff in there shows up in the same way as plastics. Fat is known to make a false positive for these kind of plastics. And so what they might be looking at is parts of the brain. So that's an issue. So, okay, so there's a bit of uncertainty in this and answers. So there's a lack of long-term studies. So we haven't been studying this for a really long time in the depth that you would need to build a kind of a body of science to understand what it's doing to people. There's also really difficult part in measuring microplastics, and also nanoplastics are even harder, which are really small in human tissue. So as we saw with the brain one, it's really quite hard to reliably distinguish between plastics and natural substances. So that means you could be raising false alarms. There's also no standard definitions. So what counts as a microplastic, and how do we collect the samples And studies are using different criteria. So that's going to make comparing them sort of not apples with apples. So you end up in this situation where you might have some studies, but you can't necessarily lump them all in together into a meta study because they are talking about different things. The other thing that is quite a consideration is, are there any contaminants or additives going on? So you can have a microplastic, but that microplastic might have other things stuck to it. And that could include chemicals that are sort of hitching a ride on the plastics. So if you see a health effect, you need to be able to determine whether that's a health effect of the plastic or the chemicals that are stuck to the plastic. So that's another, I guess, variable that needs to be accounted for and eliminated. So where did all this come from? I was sitting down watching Netflix, as you do, and I came across the Netflix documentary, The Plastic Detox. And this is just an example of some scientists sort of advocating strong conclusions before the evidence is actually exists. And in this documentary, to be fair, Dr. Shana Swan is really upfront. This is not science, this is not controlled, I'm not, doing science here. But then the rest of the show, she kind of makes it sound like it's science and that what she did worked. So what she's got is 6 couples, and in this case she's looking at fertility and the effect of microplastics on the 6 couples. So these 6 couples have been trying to conceive, and they have been diagnosed as being unexplained infertility. Now that's because they've passed the 2-year mark and there's nothing that the doctors can see that is wrong with them, but they've continued not to conceive. I guess the reality is all these people are in that 2 to 3 year window. So I guess if you had picked them sooner, they wouldn't have been diagnosed as being infertile. If you picked them too late, then they would probably have a very low chance conceiving because something might be going on there. So I guess if you wanted the most positive results possible from people that are being diagnosed as being infertile, you would want to pick them in that 2 to 3 year window. So it's very strange that she has picked them in that window. And she runs the study for 90 days of detoxification, eliminating as much plastic from around them as possible. And she bases that time frame on the fact of the 70-day life cycle of sperm. And then you have all these dramatic images panning around the house, and it shows all the appliances and all the furnishings and all the food and those kind of things. And everything's got little bubbles coming up off it, animated bubbles, like it's all radioactive. And they're talking about all these things that have this stuff. It's quite scary to watch. You can see why people might get a bit panicked about this. And this is what it does. And so then they go on this detox. And so half of them do, eventually conceive. But I think one of them might have been within the 70 days, but the timeline's a little bit fuzzy. But I guess the question is, would they have conceived anyway? Because they are in this window. They've been trying to conceive. Now they're on TV. So you would think that they would be trying a little bit harder to make things happen, not months of whatever you do. So, yeah, I'm just not too sure about that you can draw any conclusions about some of them getting pregnant. There's one couple that definitely were out. Their results kept going the opposite way, and she basically waved them off.
When it came to the microplastic exposure, did they measure the reduction? You say basically they tried to reduce their exposure, but did they measure like the levels of microplastics in the house and show that they were getting exposed to less or fewer microplastics over time?
They didn't. They measured this in their blood or something. They did some kind of test, but also the sperm quality, I guess, as well. So they were able to see whether that was tracking or not. And in one case, the couple, it wasn't showing what she wanted. It was showing they'd reduced it, but it got worse.
I mean, that's a logical leap, isn't it? That's assuming the microplastics are having an effect on sperm count, which they haven't proven. So to then use that as an analog for measuring microplastic exposure seems like it's jumping the gun.
Yeah, and it's just this one thing, but she actually talks about the fact that this is a generational thing, that getting exposed to the microplastics is getting passed down to your children and your grandchildren, and it's making their man part smaller over the generations, and it's shrinking, and their fertility's getting,
Oh my God.
she says that in the EU, all these plastics are banned, but I guess the problem with that is their sperm count's tracking exactly the same way as the US. So what point is she making here? It's not working.
This reminds me of another Netflix documentary that I watched a few years ago about veganism, where the supposed doctor, he was a guy in a lab coat, he had, I think, 3 sports people, and he put them on a vegan diet for, I think, a day, and then he measured the length and turgidity of their nocturnal erections. So the longer they were erect and the harder they were at night, apparently the more virile they were and the healthier they were. And it was like none of this is a good measurement. None of this makes any sense. The fact that someone gets more erections at night when they've had a vegan burrito, like, this is ridiculous. This is not science at all. And it's really unfortunate that Netflix keeps putting these things out.
Yeah. I mean, another dossier, she's talking about receipts of the cashier, and that they almost all receipts have BPA and then bisphenol A, and it's like, that is just wrong. It's just wrong. So, I don't know, news cycle gets ahead of the science. You've got several high-profile studies talking about microplastics, human arteries, brains, reproductive organs, which people are quite sensitive. And if you tell people of the male gender that their man parts are going to get smaller if they're exposed to plastic, they're probably going to pay more attention to it than if you'd worded that in some other way. So I guess stakes are high, but I guess, well, what's the grift here? And there is a grift. There is money to be made off people being scared of microplastics. So you can drive policy. So if you have a particular, political policy you want to drive, you could do that. Lawsuits, that's an excellent way for lawyers to make money. Plastics detox products. I didn't even know these existed, but apparently you can buy a bottle of pills and you take those pills, presumably not covered in plastic, like, God, they could be, and they detox your body somehow.
It's meant to be something that maybe binds to the microplastic and helps take it out of the body, like chelation for heavy metals, I guess. But this one's probably going to be some herbal remedy, I imagine, and it's not going to do anything.
And essentially all you're going to do is poop it out, and there's something in those tablets that change the color or the appearance of your poop, so it makes you think that you're pooping out the microplastics, but really you're just pooping out the pill.
Oh my God, yes. I think we need to make these pills and start selling them. Bronwyn, I think you're onto a winner here.
Well, I did make my 8-year-old poop blue, and then I got called into school because there was an alarming shade of bright green happened, and I was told she was sick, but it wasn't. It was something I fed her. So blue dye, no. But yeah, it's actually quite easy to change the colour of your poop, right? And so if you were going to make money out of this, then yay, rainbow poop. But you could do that. The other one's plastic-free goods, so things you can put food in, water filter systems, packaging that doesn't have plastic. And then, of course, activists and campaigners can get potentially special interest funding. So this is all money coming out of someone's pocket going to these people. But I guess what's it achieving? And what I would say is that would be much better spent on supporting the scientists to actually see what's really going on here. So there's no evidence that you can flush out microplastics from your body with special treatments or supplements, and you're potentially putting something else in your body, and we don't know what that is. It's possible that could cause some kind of harm. So I don't think you're simplifying the situation doing that. Poor research can also, on the flip side, give some ammunition to people wanting to downplay the real risk. So, it's possible there's something going on here, right? So we need the data, we need the science in order to know what that is. At the moment, the sense is we do not have that. So I think we all agree that microplastics everywhere, and probably not something we can avoid. But the science is still out on whether there are health impacts. There's no major regulatory agency that have said they are a proven health risk at the current levels that we are exposed to normally. And so we need to get more science in there, get more studies. Precaution is okay if you wanted to take precautions around it, but I don't think the evidence here is pointing toward panic. Panic is not justified. And yep, if you wanted to reduce your exposure. You can do things like making sure your house is ventilated. Maybe you decide to use less plastic in the kitchen. But you don't need to do anything too drastic. Just stay informed and support the research. And it might be that microplastics turn out to be a health concern, but at the moment the narratives that are playing are not based on real science. So that, and people just making money of that. So I think it's just, stay calm, keep interested, keep your eye on the ball. Certainly don't get carried away with things like this Netflix show, because the information in that is not science.
Thank you for that, Katrina. And I guess, Mark, now you have something else that our listeners can be a little bit wary of, taking them to an early grave. You're talking about sugar and whether it causes cancer, which reminds me how there was a really big fad. God, was it about 10 years ago? Because I remember it was when I started my midwifery training. And it was all like, I gave up sugar for life. I think that was a very popular set of cookbook/dietary advice. There was the That Sugar movie, which was done by an Australian guy. So what's the fear about sugar today and the cancer risk?
Yeah, I can't see that anybody could say that they've given up sugar for life until they're on their deathbed. I imagine for anybody, even people writing a book about it, it's probably just a passing fad and they will find themselves going back to sugar eventually.
Well, what do you know? That's exactly what happened to that Australian influencer. She basically disavowed it and she won't comment on it further. Nice.
Yeah, so this story's a little bit personal. I was out in the pub last week or the week before last, just having a chat with a friend, and we got onto this heavy topic of cancer for personal reasons, and he came out with this idea that he said, well, obviously, sugar feeds cancer, so really you need to cut out sugar if you've got cancer. And I was like, no, I don't think that's true. And he's like, yeah, my mother-in-law said the same. She doesn't agree with me. But people just know it, don't they? And I'm like, no, I don't think so. I think the fact that, it sounds pithy probably means that people remember it. But I'm pretty sure the science is not behind it. I went away and then I looked it up just to make sure that my skeptical alarm bells were going off for good reason. And I figured eventually I'd write an article about it, which I did. And I've sent a link to the article to my friend so that he can read more. But my questions were two-part, which was, one, this is wrong, right? Can I just double-check this? And then two, if it is wrong, where did it come from? And I guess conversely, if it's right, what was the evidence that showed that this was the... So I looked into it. I put sugar feeds cancer, that simple, into Google. Just the 3 words. Google's doing a fairly good job. So basically, most of the first page of results, there were a couple of scientific studies, direct links to studies, which are obviously hard for the lay people to read. But most of the first page of 10 Google results were nice little summaries. They were from places like the Cancer Research UK, Stanford Medicine, the Cancer Council of Australia, the National Breast Cancer Foundation in the US, and the Mayo Clinic. So these are reputable places, and they were of one accord. They were basically all saying the same kind of thing, which was basically that, yeah, this is not true. That sugar doesn't... Well, technically it is true, and they did a very good job of describing this, but, sugar feeds cancer basically in the way that sugar just feeds our cells. Like, we have several ways that our cells can get energy, but one of the easiest, most ready ways that our bodies can get energy and our cells can be fed is through sugar. And cancer is just our body cells gone slightly wrong, replicating out of control. So yes, they eat sugar, but just in the same way the rest of the body eats sugar. If you try and starve cells, it's not just starving it of sugar, it's starving it of other ways of getting energy as well. And when you do that, you end up starving the body. And when you starve the body, it's bad. So it's not something you want to do. Like most of the articles went into, after saying this is not a thing, you cannot stop eating sugar if you have cancer and expect any better outcome. On top of that, they said what you can do is stop eating sugar now, or at least drop your sugar intake now. If you are not healthy, if you eat so much sugar that you are overweight, being overweight is a factor in cancer. So it will increase your chances of getting certain cancers. It's not a massive risk, but the risk is there and it is measurable. And so, cancer or not, make sure you're at a healthy weight. Don't eat so much chocolate that you are obese, because you are elevating your cancer risk. So it was pretty good to see that as well. But that first page of Google results, there was one result that was the outlier. So Google hasn't quite got it fixed yet, but this basically was Precision Wellbeing, a New Zealand clinic. Seems to be a single woman outfit, Tamara O'Dwyer, and she basically says that she's focused on cancer nutrition and integrative oncology. I have become an expert regarding the metabolic theory of cancer and its application, she says. So this metabolic theory of cancer is the idea that apparently cancer prefers to eat glucose, that it goes into this kind of high glucose mode where it's just eating lots of it. And there's stuff about insulin and other stuff that comes out. And then she mentions where it comes from. So she did my homework for me. The second question I had, where does this idea of cancer being fed by sugar come from? And it's from Otto Warburg, who was a legitimate scientist, a legitimate physician who won a Nobel laureate, did some work on the different metabolic pathways for cancer cells and how they get their energy. So he did some good work. But what I then found, just to explain why we shouldn't just go with what Otto Warburg said, which was basically a century ago. So his work was about 100 years ago, but I found an article by Scientific American that said the predilection of cancer cells towards this anaerobic respiration is known as the Warburg effect. When German medical scientist Otto Warburg discovered it in 1924, he suggested this switch to glycosis might drive cancer. We now know the shift stems from the mutations that lead to cancer, rendering it a consequence rather than a cause. So basically it goes on to say that any dietary evangelists that are saying that sugar feeds cancer have missed the last century of cancer research. It's arse about face, and basically this is not a thing that you can do. This is not a way that you can treat it. So it was really good to read that the majority of the advice out there just very plainly said, no, this is not a thing. You cannot starve cancer by not eating sugar. And the last point I made in my article was that, and having been through this my brother, when I was in my early 20s, had cancer, and he died at the age of 19. And obviously it's a real bummer to have cancer and have it be terminal. And one of the things that doctors consistently talked to my brother about was making sure that, he was enjoying himself. And so when they asked him if he took drugs and if he smoked marijuana, their advice was carry on doing that. It's a joy in your life. It's something that you're enjoying. And they said, especially for the marijuana, as you go through chemotherapy, weed is going to help you to a certain extent with that, with the nausea and other things. So you have to find the joy in life where you can, especially if your life looks like it's not going to be lasting that much longer. And taking sugar away, taking away chocolate, taking away one of those joys that we all have, it's just going to make a bad time even worse. So given there's no evidence for it, given that this is quack science, no cancer patient should be cutting sugar out. They should just binge on chocolate and enjoy themselves.
I'm hungry now.
I was watching a video recently. It's been a year since apple cider vinegar has come out.
Yeah,
And we had a bit of a
Wow.
series on that, and this whole conversation about withholding sugar makes me think a little bit about the Gerson diet, even though there was a lot of fruit and veg.
Yeah, so you'd figure there'd be a lot of natural sugars, because
sugars.
they just have fruit smoothies, don't they?
Yeah. If as someone that reacts to fructose, I can attest they have a lot of sugar, and particularly some kinds of fruit. So it's not always a good thing, even a lot of fruit. And they do caution you about, drinking orange juice. And the dentists, when I take my children in, they're like, no, not orange juice, not fruit juice. It needs to be water, because of the sugar in fruit juice will actually damage children's teeth as well. There's enough sugar in there to do that.
It's often those juices in a cup is equivalent to 3 or 4 fruit. So even though fruit is healthy for you, there is a point where you can have too much fruit.
Especially with kids, when it's in a sippy cup, the idea is that it hangs around the teeth for a lot longer than just eating a piece of fruit would, that it's kind of coating the teeth for longer, and so the sugar's there as a food for much longer.
And I guess the problem is if you have too much sugar, you're getting, it's energy rich but nutrient sparse, so you're better off eating foods that have got more nutrients and they might have a bit of sugar in them, but just having stuff that's loaded with sugar is not a great option.
Chocolate as part of a balanced, healthy diet. Perfect.
Oh, okay. I stand corrected. I'm willing to change my mind.
Thank you for that, Mark. I guess I'm doing the last piece of the night, and I'm talking about Youth with a Mission. And Mark, I wasn't quite sure if you would have been familiar with this group, given where your time in Christianity was spent, but you've come across them, right? Was that in the UK or when you were in New Zealand?
Yeah, so this was in the UK. By the time I got to New Zealand, I was a newly unchristened atheist. But my time in the UK when I was a young Christian, I converted to Christianity in my late teens. But YWAM was a thing that was talked about, like people would save up money and go away on YWAM. There's a thing sometimes in the UK, it's not as big as the OE in New Zealand, but sometimes people would take what's called a gap year in the UK. You take a year out before going to university, and if you were a Christian, YWAM was definitely one of those options. You could go on a mission through this Christian organization, and it's not nowhere near as much as it sounds like it is with the Mormons, where their missionaries come back and they're kind of almost worshipped. There was a certain feeling of respect for people that had been on YWAM, who'd gone off and done this thing. You know, it was always something that people would remember to mention about someone, that they'd been to YWAM. So yeah, definitely a badge of honor within the Christian community in the UK.
And I think within Pentecost and charismatic circles, it's still seen as something quite impressive. I've been familiar with it. I couldn't really pinpoint when I first came across it. It's just always been an organization that's just been there. It's been around since the early 1960s. The founder was a big Assembly of God's person, did a lot of itinerant evangelism as well. And yeah, just really wanted to create like a lot of short-term missions for Christian youth. So it started off in the US. The guy who founded it, Lauren Cunningham, he eventually married a nurse, and she also had a lot of connections to the Canadian Pentecostal Assembly. So Canada was the first country where they were able to expand out of the US. And then he ends up splitting from the Assemblies of God because they wanted this missionary organization to fall under their control, to follow their rules. And Lauren wanted a lot of flexibility. And when he splits ways with the Assemblies of God, he ends up coming into connection with another youth Christian help group called Teen Challenge. Teen Challenge still exists today. Back in the 1960s, it was formed as a organization that was meant to deal with like youth addictions of all sorts, like sex addiction, but mostly drug, alcohol, gang, and like responding to what Christians in, the 1960s saw as the moral delinquency of the country. Today, Teen Challenge has a much worse reputation as being part of the troubled teen industry. And if you're familiar with that, what that entails is that where children are taken out of their homes in the middle of the night, tossed into a car, they have two burly guys who are making sure that they can't run away, and they are transported to a facility or a wilderness camp.
Oof.
And
yeah,
they spend...
I've seen some horror stories on YouTube and in documentaries about that happening, and it seems to be quite a big thing in the US, especially to do this to children.
Yeah. Teen Challenge now has a reputation of being part of that industry and doing that sort of activity. But back then, they just had some centers where YWAMers would be able to go and minister to these troubled youths. But it would be through the Teen Challenge program, which had already established itself in New Zealand in the early 60s, that YWAM was able to start their ministry in Auckland. So that was about 1967 that Lauren actually came. He went to Great Barrier Island. He had been invited to speak at a Christian camp. That Christian farm is still in operation. They still actually operate their own ministry school. A lot of these people are still around. And he ended up making these really great connections to the charismatic movement in New Zealand and had a very successful 6 or so weeks in New Zealand recruiting people to start undertaking missions and growing YWAM in New Zealand. And a lot of the youth that he met in the 1960s would go on to become leaders in the organization in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. Many of them would go on and be leaders of like YWAM publishing. They would start major missions or outreach organizations across the world. One guy, Kalefi Moala, he's a very well-known journalist In the Pacific, he started YWAM Japan.
Okay, so it's like a pyramid scheme. It's best to get in on the ground floor early on, and then you'll find yourself in a nice cushy position at the top.
I guess eventually, I don't know if I'd call it an MLM. I just say it's, the youth with a mission grew up to be adults with a job. That's what happened. New Zealand was there very much in the beginning. New Zealand provided a lot of manpower, and New Zealand was very conveniently placed to allow YWAM to expand both into Australia, which was due in part to the efforts of Moala, as well as expand the missionary actions and campaigns throughout the Pacific. That included Japan and Indonesia and the South and the Asian countries as well. It was a very tactical and strategic location to base themselves in. But I think the big part of what the criticisms of YWAM are now has to do with its current structure. So back in the 60s, it was sending students out on 1 to 2 year missions, maybe even shorter missions, like trying to get students out into the mission field when they only have a summer break of 2 or 3 months. And that's quite different from what was then considered the traditional missionary pathway of maybe being out in the field for 5 years. What's going on today is that there's a bit of a staggered process in which young people can become embedded into the YWAM structure. One way is to be a volunteer. And these are really, really short-term missions that requires no special training beforehand. You bring in your money, you fundraise your money, and you go off maybe for a period of a couple of weeks. Maybe you're going for 1 or 2 years, but the main thing is that you don't have to do special YWAM training. But the big thing that gets a lot of the criticism is what they call discipleship training schools, or what they call a DTS. The DTS is a very important step. You must do a DTS if you want to become a staff member. And when I say staff member, that's in quotes, that's in air quotes, because in many ways, how we understand staff member is essentially what anyone else in the world would understand a volunteer. A staff member within the YWAM structure also is unpaid. They also have to fundraise everything. They have to go through their families, friends, churches, or beg or wait on the benefaction of strangers to fund themselves. People can donate to a particular base, or they can donate to a particular person who's working on staff at YWAM if they want to help allay some of their fees. The DTS has 2 phases. One is a lecture phase, and that's for about 2 or 3 months. And that's where they'll learn about the Bible. They'll have lots of lecturers come in. They'll have a week that's quite controversial. Not all DTS schools do this, but the ones that do tend to create ex-students or ex-YWAMers who are very, very traumatized. And it can either be called the Plumb Line Week or Repentance and Forgiveness Week. And essentially, it's a really high-pressure situation in which you are there with maybe another 20, 30 youths who are also doing this discipleship training school with you. And you are really, if you're not pressured, you're certainly coerced to be in this room for hours with no food sometimes, or in some cases it's reported that there was no food for the entire day, and you're just confessing your deepest, darkest sin. And they sometimes give you a list of the sins that they may want you to confess. So some of the TikTok videos that I've shared in my article, people are talking about they just made things up in order to get the facilitators off their back. So people have come out of that talking about how traumatized it is because you tell someone your deepest, darkest secret, and then a staff member could come and use that against you. And people have talked about how that stuff has been used against them in conversations.
This all sounds a lot like both Scientology and Nexium, who both use this same thing of getting people to reveal their deepest, darkest secrets and then storing them in a filing cabinet somewhere for potential blackmail use or, controlling people so that they don't speak out against the organization later. It's horrible. Yeah,
the basis of it comes from, if you read one of Lauren Cunningham's books, Is It Really You, Lord? This actually, I think the inspiration for this practice actually happened to him in New Zealand. He had just come off from, speaking to 150 Christian youth at this camp in Great Barrier Island. And he gets this message from God that oh no, now you need to withdraw from people for a week. So he does. And he goes into a praying, fasting cycle. And he gets this message from God saying, we need to do some real serious soul surgery on you. And through this period of intense prayer, He's having to divulge, like, he's doing it in private, unlike all these poor young people who are doing it in front of 20, 30 people. From the way he tells the story, he's doing it just to God, in which he confesses the deepest, darkest sins and his pride regarding some of the reasons behind the separation with the Assemblies of God and so on. And that's what called sometimes the plumb line to God. God is helping you become center or aligned with God and what God wants you to do. It helps you clear out your soul, and then you can go off and be that instrument for God.
But it's not like just physical deprivation for a start is a brainwashing technique, dead center. You just wear someone down, you just keep going at them until they go, they mentally just give in.
And now sometimes some of the TikTokers will explain that maybe the speaker who's facilitating this is telling them, well, God says that you need to do this. And depending on where you are in terms of the denomination of Christianity, or even within the evangelical structure that you follow, I mean, someone else telling you what God's telling you that you should do is actually really questionable. It's like, actually, wait, God should speak to me, but that's not necessarily shared in all
Again, brainwashing use of authority and just having people questioning or verifying that is brainwashing.
Yeah, so some of these discipleship training schools have a theme, and they're slightly charming, and I think this is how they try to draw young people in. There's an MMA DTS in New Zealand. There are quite a few, because we're in New Zealand, quite a few of these training schools have an extreme sport, skiing and snowboarding theme, hiking, backpacking theme. That lecture portion can cost like between $5,000 to $9,000. And then when that's all done, if they've survived through that, then they can go to what they call an outreach, which can be, again, another 2 to 3 months in any country around the world. Sometimes they do go to a country like Japan if there's a mission going on, like an actual mission program going on in Japan. Or they may go through multiple countries throughout Southeast Asia or Africa, depending on what's happening within their discipleship training school. Yeah, another, like, again, 5 to 10 grand. So you are spending, I think the calculation was like, you can be spending anywhere between 10 to 20 grand for 6 months, which in terms of New Zealand dollars could be equivalent to 1 year in medical school, or maybe 2 to 3 years with a regular bachelor's degree. But you do this discipleship training school. But you're doing that because maybe you want to be staff at one of these bases around the world. But again,
parents sending them on this. Because they don't have that money. That's coming from...
they fundraise, because it's not just all 18-year-olds. It can be anyone between like 18 to 30. That's kind of the target group, though sometimes they do have like older couples, retired couples come in and do a discipleship training school. There are DTSs that are geared towards that population. So largely these are young people. Maybe they're doing this instead of going to university. They're fundraising from the church. They're fundraising from their parents and friends and family, but also potentially if they had a job beforehand, some of them are saving to go on these things. So sometimes it is their own money. But the risk is, of course, once you complete a discipleship training school and you do get a staff job, you're a missionary per se, or you're working towards helping people become missionaries. And there is no, from what I've been reading anyways, there's no financial security. There's no deposits of money being made into, say, your a retirement account or 401k. In terms of what's happening in New Zealand, I don't know if anyone would be doing that deposit into your KiwiSaver. There's very little transparency as to what's happening to them with money in YWAM, in New Zealand, or internationally, because it's kind of a decentralized structure. All of these bases are meant to act as like little fiefdoms in their own right. So the YWAM building in Oxford doesn't really have much to do with the YWAM in Queenstown, if you know what I mean. Like there's generally maybe some overarching guidance that comes down from YWAM International, but really each group to their own. Or at least I should say it has been for many, many years. There have been some groanings and comments I've come across on Reddit where it has been alleged that now that Lauren Cunningham has died just a few years ago, YWAM internationally is trying to kind of cut down on the number of these themed DTSs. There's a couple of discipleship training schools which have gotten a little bit big for their boots. They're very, very popular. Hundreds of students trying to get into these particular DTSs. There are some ways in which apparently YWAM's trying to cut down and trying to actually bring all these bases back to the roots of prayer and worship and being a mission. One of the things that have come out, particularly about the discipleship training schools, or one of the more controversial accusations, is how discipleship training schools may restrict communication between the attendees and their families, as well as accusations that some mixed beliefs about healing. So I'll talk to the first one first. It's just pretty simple. It's been accused in some of the bases that students were told, like, hey, you really need to make sure that the people that you're communicating with aren't sinning. They aren't going to tempt you to rebel and leave this path of Christ that you're going down on. And
brainwashing, social isolation.
And, YWAM is a popular organization for young people who have just become newly Christian. So here they are. They really want to do this Christianity thing, and you have someone telling you that. It's messed up. The second one, I've heard mixed stories about the beliefs about medication. Some ex-YWAMers have reported that they were told, like, hey, if you have faith in God, then you will stop taking your medication. You will stop taking your antidepressants. There's been people who have been said, I've been convicted and I'm going to stop taking this medication that treats my life-limiting condition and I'll be cured. Other people have reported that they had a fellow student who did stop taking some very important heart medication, and the staff had zero tolerance for that. They're like, if you think God is telling you to do that, you are wrong. God would never tell you to stop taking your life-saving medication. And they sent the student home. So it's a bit of a toss-up. A set of videos that I shared by a TikToker called Silky Mama, or The Silky Mama. She was with a YWAM base in Perth. They go overseas. Even though she has no medical training, she is assigned the role as a nurse. So she's meant to provide some medical care, but they're so poorly equipped that she had one set of gloves on a country that had a very high rate of HIV, and she had to use that one set of gloves to treat everybody, which is problematic.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like the approved way of doing things in most countries.
Not at all. Still took some time after, she completed her DTS to kind of actually unpack all the crazy shit that happened to her. If you complete the discipleship training school, and not everyone does, some people, do walk away and say, hey, what you're doing is religiously heretical, or actually I'm feeling very psychologically unsafe here. People do leave. You aren't trapped there. But again, some people, I think, do feel obligated to stay. There's a lot of pressure, especially if you do come from a family where mission work is something that is seen as a quite elevated calling. You may feel obligated to stay there. But if you do finish discipleship training school, then you can try to apply for what's called a staff job. And again, that's just sort of working either at any of the bases, or, maybe you are working more appropriately at a mission. I think one of the major missions that we have in New Zealand is called the YWAM Ships Aotearoa. And that is kind of like a medical ship. And they'll travel around Pacific. They'll have doctors and nurses and trained marine, people who know how to run a ship. And they'll go across all these Pacific countries providing free healthcare. I'm talking they are actually doing proper surgeries, like dental surgeries and so on like that. So that is the one main mission in New Zealand, because YWAM used to run Mercy ships for many, many years, until I think they did that for 20 years.
Yeah, that was a surprise to read that Mercy ships came from YWAM.
Because Lauren always wanted to have a ship. His vision was that you have this ship and you're taking all your youth around and they're proselytizing. And again, his first attempt at that was in New Zealand. He tried to buy the ferry, the Maori. And it got to the news that he was going to try to buy this really well-known ferry. And it was presented that, we're going to redo it, and we're going to take the car deck and turn it into an auditorium. And we're going to take this ferry to California, pick up youth and staff, and bring them back to New Zealand in time for the Commonwealth Games. And then travel around New Zealand and pick up and drop off people so they can go see the games, as well as spread the word of God. I think back in the day when ships were cheap, I suppose, it was about $480,000 is how much the ferry cost.
Yeah, it sounds like a bargain.
Wow.
Cheaper than my house.
Although it's cheap, ferries aren't really designed for long distance, ocean journeys. Yeah. Going to the US and back sounds fraught with danger.
Well, I think they were going to take it up to Hong Kong to get it refitted a little bit. So there was some work that needed to be done. But I think the time frame was horrendously unrealistic. So it was about $480,000. They they were able to pay at least 10% of the deposit. I've seen figures of about $48K to $72K tossed around. And there was supposed to be a big sponsor who would give them the money who lived in Singapore, but the money never materialized. So after asking and begging and pleading for extensions, and they got at least 2, the sale failed. And it was quite embarrassing for Lauren that it failed. And God was teaching him a lesson that he glorified Jesus.
So he did nothing wrong. It was a lesson that he had to learn, so he was faultless.
But I think by the 1970s, they were able to buy a ship, and then they had that ship for many, many years working in Africa. They also have YWAM ships in Australia. Unlike New Zealand and unlike Mercy ships, the program in Australia actually runs a discipleship training school using the ship. So you will have young people who will do their outreach, like they will learn they will get some, international healthcare training and volunteer on the ship in Australia, which goes to sort of Papua New Guinea. Whereas in New Zealand and Mercy ships, they're very, very strict about who's going on the ship. It's like you must be a doctor, you must either have skills like naval skills, or you have skills in medicine and nursing care. Mercy ships and YWAM ships in Aotearoa are, to what, in terms of my understanding, are very much a mission, whereas in Australia, there's a little bit of that education aspect as well. Also, there's an opportunity to go and get some university credits, but it's credits to an unaccredited university in the US. But I'm certain that within some circles, someone who goes and gets a counseling degree from this University of Nations in Hawaii, someone who has that degree may not be able to come work at, say, Ministry of Health because that degree will not be recognized. You're coming out with a degree that's not recognized in many countries. You may not be able to get your credits transferred if you wanted to go and get a legitimate degree. That's a very scary proposition. But they probably could get a job in ministry counseling at, say, one of the local churches. There is sort of that parallel job market within, within the Christian community, within Christian churches and colleges that allows for that to happen. So that's kind of what I'm keen to share regarding YWAM. Read the article. I've included a lot of really great links. There's a lot of amazing videos out there of topics I just wasn't able to cover. The whole situation, the financial situation, and what happens to YWAMers when they leave YWAM, particularly if they've been in staff positions for like 4 or 5 years. It's a very financially unsecure position.
If people want to read your article or any other article, they should just go to articles.skeptics.nz and everything's up there. So when we talk on the podcast, it's based on the articles we write, but hopefully the two are different enough that reading the articles will be useful. There's a whole bunch of links in our articles as well. We like to source where we find things from and give you places where there's further reading and you can learn more. So go to articles.skeptics.nz if you're interested in learning more about anything we talk about on the podcast.
Thank you for that plug, Mark. And I guess
it sounded like a proper advert, didn't it? There really was.
It did. Maybe we need to put that through AI and give it a bit of a juju. But before we sign off for this fortnight, we do have time for a brief membership corner. The next Wellington Skeptics in the Pub will be Friday, April the 17th at 6 p.m. We're at the Intercontinental Hotel on 2 Gray Street. The lobby lounge has gotten a facelift with new carpet and furniture. So come have a nosy, meet the dedicated group of Wellington Skeptics, and enjoy some nice food and beverage. As for the Auckland Skeptics in the Pub, they are returning to the Dice and Fork on May 5th at 6:30 p.m. Then we have the early bird tickets, which are still on sale for our conference. This conference will be held in Christchurch from July 31st to August 2nd with our special guest, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. So visit our website at conference.skeptics.nz, and we have a link there to our Humanitix page, so you can buy your tickets there. Also, just want to announce for the Super SGU fans, the Rogues of the SGU are hosting a separate event on the evening of July 31st. This is their extravaganza of special skeptical significance. This is an event that is not included in the weekend conference paths. And so you will need to head over to the SGU website to get your tickets. There are a limited number of seats available, so you'll need to get in quick. If you have any comments, questions, queries, kudos, or concerns, please email us at news@skeptics.nz or podcast@skeptics.nz. That's all for this episode of the Yeah Nah podcast. We'll be back with more skeptical news in a fortnight. Ka kite!
Later.
See ya.